Hello and welcome to this webcast, an introduction to Exposure Draft 79, Non-Current Assets Held for Sale and Discontinued Operations. I'm Joanna Spencer, part of the IPSASB's technical staff. I'm a manager, standards development and technical projects. This webcast will provide an overview of the proposals made in ED 79, Non-Current Assets Held for Sale and Discontinued Operations. There is a separate at-a-glance summary document as well as the exposure draft itself. All these documents can be found at the IPSASB's website www.ipsasb.org. ED 79 is one exposure draft of a package of 4 interrelated exposure drafts. These have been issued together to allow constituents to assess how all proposals fit together. The other exposure drafts issued with ED 79 are ED 76, Conceptual Framework, Chapter 7, Measurement Update, ED 77, Measurement, and ED 78, Property, Plant and Equipment. This webcast will give an overview of why the IPSASB undertook this project, the criteria that must be met for a non-current asset to be classified as held for sale, which assets are not included in the scope of ED 79, the measurement requirements that apply when an asset is classified as held for sale, the exemptions to these measurement requirements, the presentation and disclosure of both assets classified as held for sale and for discontinuing operations, and the next steps in this project. The decision to develop ED 79 arose as part of the IPSASB's 2019 to 2023 Strategy and Work Plan, when in March 2020 the IPSASB reviewed its current work program and agreed to take a holistic approach for related projects. This decision was sparked by the approval of the Conceptual Framework Project Brief. All interrelated projects would be managed holistically to maintain consistency throughout the publications. As mentioned, these projects include Conceptual Framework Limited Scope Update Measurement, Measurement, Property, Plant and Equipment, and this project, Non-Current Assets Held for Sale and Discontinued Operations. The purpose of ED 79 is to develop an IPSAS aligned with IFRS 5, Non-Current Assets Held for Sale and Discontinued Operations. Currently there is no IPSAS that provides guidance on how to account for non-current assets or a disposal group when they are made available for sale. Therefore, ED 79 proposes this guidance, for example, if a government wants to sell a school. It also proposes the presentation and disclosure requirements for discontinued operations, say for example, if a nuclear power station is to be decommissioned. Now we know what an IPSAS developed from ED 79 is hoping to achieve, we need to discuss when should assets be classified as held for sale. Firstly, it is important to note that the proposals in ED 79 only apply to non-current assets or disposal groups that are to be sold. Assets that are held for sale on a regular basis, for example inventories, are not within the scope of ED 79. The key principle to classify a non-current asset as held for sale is that the carrying amount of that asset will be recovered through sale. When an asset is used in an operational capacity, the carrying amount is recovered through depreciation, but to be classified as held for sale, it must be expected that the carrying amount will be recovered through a sales transaction. That is, the seller will receive compensation for that asset. There are certain criteria that must be met for a non-current asset to be classified as held for sale. These are as follows. The asset must be available for immediate sale in the condition it is in. Therefore, if an asset needs rehabilitation before it can be sold, for example from a chemical spill, it cannot be classified as held for sale until this rehabilitation has been completed. Also, the sale must be highly probable. So what is meant by highly probable? There are criteria that must be met for a sale to be highly probable. These are: the management of the entity must be committed to sell, and this also means that the management has the relevant authority to sell. A commitment to sell can be indicated by there being an active program to locate a buyer, which is another criterion for the sale to be highly probable. This program must have been initiated. The asset must be marketed at a price that is reasonable to its fair value. If the asset is priced too highly, then this may be an indication that management are not serious about selling the asset. If the price is too low, then you might question whether the key principle of recovering the carrying amount through sale is realistic. Finally, the sale is expected to be completed within 12 months. Now, there is an extension to this if certain factors are met. This timeline can be extended. Often it is said that because public sector assets can take longer to sell, that this standard would not be appropriate. The sale of public sector assets can be lengthy because there may be regulatory or legislative permissions to gain before a sale can take place. Whilst this may be the case, it is important to remember that a criterion is that the asset must be available for immediate sale. If permission to sell has not been given, then the asset is not available for immediate sale and cannot be classified as held for sale. Once those permissions have been given, then the asset can be classified as held for sale. There are some non-current assets that cannot be classified as held for sale, and these include abandoned assets. ED 79 states that abandoned assets should not be classified as held for sale. If an asset has been abandoned, its carrying amount will not be recoverable through sale, but rather through continuing use. Therefore, abandoned assets do not meet the criteria to be classified as held for sale. Idle assets should also not be classified as held for sale. Idle assets may only be idle for a limited period, and then they may be used again. Like abandoned assets, the carrying amount of an idle asset will be recovered through continuing use and not through sale, and therefore should not be classified as held for sale. Further, assets to be transferred to another entity. If an entity plans to transfer an asset to another entity for no or little consideration, then again the carrying amount will not be recovered through a sale. As such, the key principle for an asset to be classified as held for sale has not been met. When a decision has been made to sell a non-current asset or disposal group, the measurement requirements can be split into two parts: before classification and after classification. Immediately before classification is held for sale, the asset must be measured in accordance with the applicable standard so that the normal rules apply. For example, property, plant and equipment is accounted for under IPSAS 17. If the asset were held using the cost model, the asset would be depreciated and impaired if necessary. If the asset were held under the revaluation model, the asset would be revalued. Regardless of which model is used, measuring the asset under the applicable standard will provide a new carrying amount. Now the asset must be measured after classification. The principle for this measurement is that when classified as held for sale, the asset is measured at the lower of carrying amount and fair value less cost to sell. It is also important to remember that once an asset is classified as held for sale, depreciation ceases. There are some exemptions to these measurement principles, and these are as follows. Deferred tax assets use the relevant international or national standard dealing with income taxes. Assets arising from employee benefits use IPSAS 39 employee benefits. Financial assets within scope of IPSAS 41 financial instruments. Non-current assets that are accounted for using the fair value model in IPSAS 16 investment property. Non-current assets that are measured at fair value less cost to sell in IPSAS 27 agriculture. And groups of contracts within the scope of the relevant international or national standard dealing with insurance contracts. This exemption does not mean that these assets cannot be classified as held for sale, but rather that when these assets are to be sold, the measurement principles in the applicable standard takes precedence over those in ED 79. Moving on to the disclosure requirements for non-current assets classified as held for sale, the following are required. These assets must be disclosed separately from other assets in the Statement of Financial Position. This provides clarity to users about which assets an entity is selling. Any liabilities associated with these assets must also be disclosed separately from other liabilities. This is particularly important for disposal groups. These assets and liabilities must not be offset. ED 79 also proposes for assets measured at their carrying amount, the fair value of these assets be disclosed if the fair value is materially different to the carrying amount. This disclosure is not required by IFRS 5, but was added by the IPSASB to provide transparency and accountability about the sale of public sector assets. ED 79 also requires a description of the nature of the assets held for sale and the circumstances surrounding the sale. As mentioned earlier, ED 79 also provides the presentation and disclosure requirements for discontinued operations. The following are to be presented and/or disclosed. The results of discontinued operations are to be presented as a single amount. The cash flows attributable to the operating, investing and financing activities of the discontinued operations, and the amount of income from continuing operations and from discontinued operations attributable to the owners of the controlling entity. This has been a brief introduction to the proposals made in ED 79 for assets classified as held for sale and discontinued operations. The next steps are: ED 79 contains one specific matter for comment, and constituents are invited to respond to this and also to any other proposals within the exposure draft. The closing date for comments is 25 October 2021. Submissions can be made through the IPSASB website using the Submit a Comment link on the EDs page, and further information about this project can also be found on the IPSASB's website under the ED 79 project page, which can be found under Consultations and Projects and then Work Program. Thank you for listening. I'm Joanna Spencer, and I look forward to receiving your comments on ED 79. Goodbye.